AP, this is 11th honors lit. We're just talking about the essay topics. The first two I'll review later. We're talking about the relationship of Jim and Huck. And I'm trying to paraphrase Jeff, that there was some of this almost inherent racism that he had to overcome. And we're trying to think of examples of that racism you even see in Huck. One was the example that he said when he realized Jim was just like him, he said he may be black on the outside, but he's white on the inside. And just the racism of that black is bad and white is good. Can you think of other things that changed him and how he changed? Like what caused him to change from those stereotypical ideas of a slave? Yeah.
Well, this doesn't have to do with racism or slavery, but something that changed Huck was when the Jews were doing the Wilk scheme, there was just a point that Huck couldn't really go on with it anymore, so he finally, something shifted in him to tell the daughter everything about it, so that kind of changed him a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a turning point for Huck. Not necessarily in relation to Huck to Jim. It sort of answers number 5. 5 and 3 are similar. They kind of overlap, just like 1 and 2 overlap. When we write about these, there's a good chance I would put those two together. Like 1 and 2, I'd sort of phrase a question that might include both of them, and then 3 and 5 would be the same. So we're talking about how Huck changed when he was at the Wilks. Finally, for the first time, he actually does something about the king and the duke. He tries to do something to thwart their actions. First time he's done this. Can you think of let's just use the times that he tricked Jim. I can think of 3 times he played a trick on Jim, and the aftermath of those tricks show a progression from just from no reaction at all to actually forgiveness. Guilt to actually confession. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like the first time we see him playing a trick, it was the hat. Remember when this is before they even escaped town, and they just put a hat on a limb, and they kind of laugh at Jim, who makes this elaborate story about it. But there's no feeling of guilt about that. The second time he tricks Jim that I can remember is the snake skin, which actually hurts. The snake comes back and bites Jim. How does he feel about that? Remember, the first time it was a minor trick or joke. He feels no guilt. How did he feel about Jim getting bit? Remember? Yes.
Felt guilty.
Felt very guilty. But did he say anything to Jim about it? No, he didn't. He didn't say anything. He didn't confess. He was just sorry he did. The third time he tricks Jim is when they're separated by the fog, and Jim. Yeah, well, he was worried about Huck, and Huck shows up while Jim's asleep and said, "You basically dreamed that we were separated." And then Jim finds out that it wasn't a dream. He looks around, he realizes this was not a dream. You remember how he reacted to that?
Scared.
Well, he wasn't scared, but he was disappointed and angry. He called Huck boss, which is something a slave probably would call a white person that, because he has to show some respect. And you remember what Huck did as a result of that?
Felt bad.
But he did more than that. He felt bad about the snake skin, but that's all. He apologized, and he made a point. Again, it goes back to what Jeff was saying about kind of racism. He was apologizing to a slave. There's something wrong about that, he said. And it was hard to do it because he was a slave, which shows that he's still not seeing him as a full human being. He's a slave, which is not as full a human being, and unfortunately, that belief. So I think you would have to talk about those examples if you were gonna write about this, yes. I've got a couple of others that I'd like you to consider, and one is when Jim tells Huck about his family. Do you remember what surprised, this goes to again what Jeff said, do you remember what surprised Huck about Jim?
That he had a family.
Yeah, but how did he feel about it? He learned that Jim felt what way toward his family? He loved them. And again, he didn't know, maybe, I guess, he didn't know slaves were capable of loving other people. That's absurd. But that shows you how ridiculous the racism was. And particularly the story of Elizabeth, we talked about that, remember? Elizabeth was deaf, he didn't know it, and the door slammed, and he had just struck her in the face because she wasn't listening to him. Well, she couldn't hear him. And it really tore him up that he treated her that way. And that surprised Huck, that a slave could have feelings. This is a really important question. Does Huck ever criticize slavery? Does he ever change his mind about the institution of slavery? No. What he does do is become friends with one slave and tries to help that slave. And remember we said yesterday, he feels so bad about it that he's willing to go to hell for it, yeah.
Do you think that Huck was also maybe surprised that Jim felt guilt about hitting his daughter because, you know, so his dad was never sorry about hitting him?
Exactly. Jim is 100 times better father than Pap was. And Pap would have never said, Pap tried to kill him. You know, Pap, that's a really good comparison or contrast. Pap abused regularly Huck by beating him or, you know, essentially kidnapped him and, what is it, he locked him up in the cabin. And one time we see Jim doing something that none of us would never want to slap a child in the face. He did it, and one time, all it took to realize it was a bad thing. That's a really good example. All right, why don't we finish with this? We just got two more, and can you think of, we're kind of on a roll, discuss the river as a symbol in the novel. Yeah.
So, the river is a symbol or practically a form of transportation. It takes them up and then back down throughout that whole area. And it transports them through different chapters, literally different chapters of their story. And it's also a place of safety. They hide on the river.
That's three, he's mentioned three things so far. And I think, if you're not writing it down, I don't know why, because I said you could use these next week when we write. So he mentioned safety, transportation, and what was the other thing? It's kind of a plot.
Like taking them through different chapters of their lives.
Yeah, it's a plot device, because they literally go from chapter to chapter via the river. So the river takes them literally to where they want to go in the story, but it also takes it to the next adventure. Yeah.
It's kind of like the Couch and Family Guy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, what?
After the Couch and Family Guy, because like after every episode,
It's just the couch.
yeah, they always end up back on the couch, ready to start the new episode, and all the stuff that happened in the early episode usually doesn't carry over to the next episode.
Yeah.
That's a really good example. I have never seen that. I just now realized what you were talking about. But that is a really good example. It's a plot device, and it's a way to tie in the stories and separate the stories. Good job. Yeah.
I said it was a symbol of freedom. For Jim, it was a symbol of freedom from slavery, and for Huck, it was a symbol of freedom from his father.
Excellent. So safety is terms of symbols, safety, freedom. freedom, transportation. What other things? And those are positive. Can you think of anything negative about the river? Because the river is not all good to them.
Death,
Deception.
Give me an example.
whenever, what was the one where Buck died, was that near the river?
It was in the, yeah, he was shot and ended up in the river, yes. Yes.
Will the river like gets them separated from each other?
Yeah, the fog does that. So you could add natural disaster, I mean, fog and flood. Remember, that takes place on the river. The flood washes the house down the river, and it kills the men in the steamboat, or the wrecked steamboat. The flood causes their death, and it's the fog on the river causes them to be separated. And what does it also cause? Yeah.
Well, the steamboat crashed into Huck and Jim.
It's a danger, it can be a dangerous place, as good as it is, freedom, safety, in some sense it's safety, but in some sense it's danger. Yeah,
You could also say that it makes it so, well, I don't know how I could word it, but, they can't go back, really, they can't go back upstream. And just like how life always moves forward, the river always moves downstream.
that's really good too. The river doesn't change directions, and it always goes south. And, that's a really good, actually mentioned that in one respect yesterday. When they leave a previous chapter, not only do they leave it like in their minds, but they leave it literally. Because the river, you can't go back to that place. Just like you can't go back to your past, you can't relive it. They cannot turn around. And think about the irony of the direction they're going. Once they miss Cairo, remember why they had to go to Cairo, why they were headed for Cairo?
The southernmost free city.
And they wanted to go up the Ohio River because they weren't gonna stay in Illinois because of why? Why could an escaped slave not feel safe in Illinois? Fugitive slave laws. They were gonna have to get as far north as possible, perhaps even Canada, via the Ohio River. Of course, they would have to take a steamboat up the Ohio River, because that also flows south, west and south. So what happens when they miss Cairo? And what happens to their plan, and what's the irony? Why did Jim want to escape to begin with?
Escape slavery.
Because they were gonna even sell him down the river.
Yeah.
What direction is he going?
Yeah.
So ironically, he's heading in the direction that this whole thing started, because he didn't wanna go down the river. Now he's going down the river, yet not because of his own choice, because of nature, and all of that. Yeah, can you think of any other dangers on the river, or any other positive things?
Dangerous drowning, obviously.
Right, yeah, that was,
That's,
I mentioned just two others. They eat out of the river. I mean, their food comes from the river in a lot of respects. But also, it's aesthetically pleasing. You know what I mean by that? Aesthetics. What are aesthetics? That's just simple beauty. Your understanding of beauty is what we refer to. And think of how many times they would sit on the raft and look up at the stars, or Huck would comment how beautiful the river was here, and how wide it was. And I would, maybe even a third thing, and this could go in number 3 or number 4. Think about, we're given an entire chapter in which all they do is talk to each other. They talk about Frenchmen, they talk about Solomon, they talk about kings and dukes. So it's a place for them to get to know each other. That's what families do. That's what friends do. They spend time talking and talking about the world. And so the river provides that opportunity. We might as well just shove on talking about rivers and boats. The last one is very much connected to the third one, but discuss other people besides Jim that maybe who teach him things, who are influences on him. Yeah.
The Shepherdsons, they teach him that, well, indirectly, but they show him that if you get into the feud, pretty much you're gonna die at some point. It's a bad thing to do.
Right, and Buck in particular, he learns a lot from Buck. He's a companion. He likes Buck. Of course, besides Jim, who else? Tom Sawyer. Yeah, that's one of his weaknesses. He wants to be like Tom Sawyer. And we talked about this yesterday, I believe. What's the irony when Aunt Sally thinks he is Tom Sawyer? What's ironic about that?
That's his dream.
That was almost his dream, to be Tom Sawyer. All of a sudden, he's Tom Sawyer. You could think of any of the episodes in both Dodge and Sherburne teach him something. So number 5 is probably more something I would put into number 3. So I think what I'm gonna do next week, I haven't put it on the schedule. You don't have to have finished the book, although you're reading the book. I think we could probably write this essay before, sometime next week, before we take the test. And then that gives you, I think you know the book pretty well. It's an opportunity to make 2 pretty good grades, important grades. So I think we'll do that. And I'll look at it that. Originally, I thought about tomorrow. That's too soon. So we'll do it next week. We got people out, so we'll do it one day next week. Good job with that. I think your discussion was good as any class that I've had talk about that. So well done. And if you'll let me, I'm gonna review what I forgot to record. So if you just give me a minute, I'm gonna try to review 1 and 2. This is question 1 talks about sentimentality. We define sentimentality as overly emotional. And I think our examples were that sentimentality can lead to being cheated, it can lead to being hurt, and some of the examples were the mobs that are swayed by emotions, the people at the camp meeting who were cheated by the king, the people of the Royal Nonsuch who were cheated by the Duke and the King, all of which were fueled one case by pity and the other case by anger. The relationship between the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords are fueled by anger, so that's sentimentality. Can I mention one other thing while it's on my mind? I don't think you could answer sentimentality without mentioning Emmeline Grangerford, because she's the perfect example, perfectly bad example, a good example of how bad she's obsessed with death. She draws silly pictures. I'm going to show you some tomorrow. I found some. She writes silly poetry, but she's obsessed with death. So she is a bad example, or an example of sentimentality. So we picked it up with number 3 just a minute ago, but be able to define sentimentality and how it leads to violence. Huck and Jim are not violent people, and Tucker had mentioned the fact that Jim is conditioned, to use that word, as a slave not to be violent. He can't afford to be violent. Huck is conditioned as a 14-year-old boy, essentially an orphan and an abused boy, to not be violent. So they're probably not violent because they're not sentimental, but they're also don't have the ability, the authority, the opportunity to be violent. They're not used to it. They spent their whole life trying to avoid violence done to them. And so we will be writing an essay on this sometime next week, so check Google Classroom, and I'll end it right there.